What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on 5 times I wanted to rage quit. Because despite being a pretty mellow person generally, when you play and review as many games as I do, you're bound to run into some frustrating sequences, let's say. And while I don't do a ton of Let's Plays and things like that, so people don't often see me get angry about these things, there are absolutely times when I'm reviewing games where it is incredibly frustrating, to say the least. And because of the nature of my reviews, I'll usually come back to it when I've cleared my head a little bit, but I thought it would be fun to share a few times where I just kind of had to get up and walk away for like an hour, work on some other stuff, come back to it, that kind of thing. So with that in mind, let's dive into these and talk about it. First up, we have Lies of P, a recent, very well done Souls-like that I myself reviewed pretty favorably. There wasn't one specific moment involved in this, more a string of the same thing repeated across bosses that got really old really quickly. And hilariously, after I had finished playing and reviewing this one, they nerfed this down a little bit to be less frustrating. But broadly speaking, it is all the bosses with full second phases and health bars. Lies of P can be broken down into several chapters, and at the end of each of those chapters is a major boss. There's usually one or two minor ones on the way to this, but each major boss is meant to be a big cinematic fight, which can certainly be pretty fun. But in some instances, pre-nerf, it was very frustrating because more than half of the bosses like this in Lies of P would come at you in a second phase with an entirely full new health bar, as opposed to something like a second phase where they just kind of change up their patterns a little bit or get faster or deal more damage. In Lies of P, these are just effectively a second boss fight right after the first, because in addition to the new health bar, they have new attack patterns, new attacks you may or may not know how to deal with, which means that you're not just fighting one boss, you're fighting two bosses back to back, and trying to memorize the exact pattern of each one and not kind of get lost in the haze there was what I struggled with the most in Lies of P. And while doing this on one or two bosses I don't think is a big deal, it can even be well done in certain instances, it was just the fact that it kept happening because, again, like 2/3 of Lies of P's bosses are like this. It got to a point where I just kind of knew it was going to happen beforehand, as you usually have this big lumbering slow first boss and then it's followed up by a second phase that is faster and heavier hitting, and generally with longer combos, of course. So for my first run of Lies of P, when I was coming up on the end of it, the last few bosses are all clustered really close together as well, so it's just like boss, short area, boss, and then another boss. And with this mechanic in play, I was pretty over it. The last string of bosses, I just had to get up and walk away for the day, and I came back to it the next day, and it still took me like 2 more hours of grinding it out to beat it for the first time. So needless to say, I was pretty furious about it, and in my review, this got reflected by mentioning exactly that. I got really exhausted with the second phase situation with these. And as I mentioned, after the fact, this did wind up getting patched and is easier to deal with now, but it was certainly memorable if nothing else. Second up on the list, we have the Woman's Lot DLC from Kingdom Come Deliverance. Another game I enjoyed a lot, an RPG set in the Holy Roman Empire, and we follow the story of Henry through a very harrowing experience that sees him going from being just kind of a witless peasant to a full-blown knight, or just kind of whoever else you can morph him into. And in many ways, it reminded me of Oblivion minus the magic. But one thing that really frustrated me in a game that is known for frustrating people was actually this Woman's Lot DLC, and specifically the questline called the Madonna of Sasau. Though I will say at the beginning of this section, I think some of the frustration I ran into was very much so intentional, like it was kind of designed to show that this is what people in that time had to deal with, but it went from being a game that actually had a lot of choice and approaches to things to being very specific about the way this DLC pans out, where it kind of feel like I got robbed of options, though to be fair is kind of accurate to the time period, I would say, so it's an interesting mix of emotions there. But essentially, in this quest line, we see one of Henry's friends get accused of witchcraft, more or less, And across the quest line, depending on how you complete it and the choices you make, it's possible to prove her innocence and save her. However, doing so is incredibly difficult, and it is incredibly easy to fail this in some way, especially since you have to deal with a high-ranking member of the church, and saying even the most innocuous wrong thing to this guy can see you jailed, and then you miss the trial for Johanka, at which point she dies. It's also possible to get yourself killed, and I wound up, I would say, failing to do this properly like 4 or 5 times on my own, and I wound up having to look up a guide to see how to actually do it and get it done. So needless to say, I was getting incredibly frustrated with the situation around this, but as I mentioned, hilariously, I do think this is somewhat intentional. I think it's meant to show that this is kind of just the situation for a lot of people back then, especially women, as the name of the DLC would imply. So in a bizarre way, as frustrating as I found this experience, I do think it successfully manages to do exactly what it was trying to do, which is probably one of the more interesting experiences with video games I've ever had. But it does make this list because I very much so was incredibly angry about it. Though, to switch speeds a little bit, I want to talk about a game I haven't talked about in a while, and that is Dragon Age Inquisition. A polarizing title, to be sure, and for many valid reasons, I would say. Though, regardless of whether or not you like Inquisition or not, the part about it that frustrated me the most was actually the DLC and the difficulty spikes involved there. I played Inquisition quite a bit. It was one of my first 100% reviews even, so it's quite old if you do go choose to watch it, but I still feel pretty much the same way about it. Though I imagine the problem I'm about to discuss here really only comes up if you're playing on the higher difficulties, which is generally how I enjoyed playing this game. Because on something like just normal, I found it just honestly a little too easy, with the combat kind of lacking any depth as a result. But on, I believe it was called Nightmare, you had a decent tactical challenge. You had to set things up, make sure all of your AI orders were being executed properly on that screen. You could even engage in a little bit of tactics, and while it was nothing too crazy compared to a lot of games I've played, it was enjoyable. That is, until you get to the DLC. Because every DLC for Inquisition decided that difficulty should be dictated by how easily the enemies can one-shot you, which was just a very different direction in terms of how they balanced and approached combat compared to the base game, that across its 3 DLCs, or 3 major DLCs, there were multiple times I had to just get up and come back to it. And at the time, I wasn't really doing this full time, so that was honestly kind of easier to do in some ways because I would just go to work or something, come back and play it later. But I really hated that a lot of the DLC was balanced around just being able to wipe out your party members rather than more interesting mechanics. When you have new fights with the dragon in Jaws of Hakan, as an example, rather than really bring anything genuinely new, they just ramped up the damage numbers instead. And it's again just across all the DLCs, and I remember in The Descent in particular, which was meant to be a more difficult one though. On max difficulty, I wound up getting into a fight with just like trash mobs for like 15 minutes, because even with the best of the best weapons, I was barely doing any damage to them. And for me, moments like that is where, with Dragon Age Inquisition, I was just like, this is just not fun, and I would rather not continue to do this, despite the fact that I went on to do so. Though that does bring us to number 4 on this list, and this is none other than Galdera from Octopath Traveller 2. The super boss for that particular title. Often JRPGs like that will have a secret optional boss that is meant to be like the ultimate challenge that can take upwards of like an hour to fight. Galdera performs that function in Octopath Traveller 2. Though as far as super bosses go, easily one of my least favorites, I would say, because for starters, just getting to the thing involves completing a bunch of steps and optional quests, which is kind of annoying in and of itself. But what makes this one really frustrating is, for starters, it uses your entire roster of party members. So 2 teams of 4, and you have to prioritize which party goes when, because the different phases of the Galdera fight, there's 2 of them, have different weaknesses and resistances, so you have to prioritize which party is on which phase because it swaps halfway through. And while generally you want to have the best of the best characters possible, you also have to deal with attacks from this boss in both phases that will just wipe out all the buffs you've accumulated on your characters. And of course, there are even more mechanics that I'm not going to dive deeply into here, but what ultimately made me rage quit with this particular fight is a bit more simple than all the others. It just wiped the floor with me several times before I was able to beat the thing. Had to look up guides, compile some theories from people on Reddit who had messed around with it, that kind of thing, and it was just a boss that by the time I got done with it, I was just done with it. And if I never fight that boss again, it'll be too soon. And in a somewhat similar manner, with slight spoilers for Remnant 2, we have the final boss of Remnant 2, the sequel, of course, to Remnant from the Ashes that released earlier this year. Overall, a really fun game that in many ways combines what I like about both ARPGs and Souls-likes to make something that is pretty unique, that, again, I just enjoyed quite a bit. But there was one part of that game which I really did not like, which was the final boss. And the reason for that is this sort of bizarre phase shift ability that it has. You see, you're actually fighting this boss in two different places at once, and intermittently between the fight as you whittle down its health, you'll sort of phase in and out of these different realities. But as you do so, you'll shift into those realities like in the middle of an attack that it's doing, which means you need to dodge immediately. And while there is a timing to these things, the phase shift nature of that, which means you kind of have to get ready to dodge attacks that you literally cannot see, makes learning that pattern incredibly difficult. And I died to this boss on the higher difficulties more times than I care to mention, but probably in the ballpark of like 20 to 30. And trying to memorize and again learn that pattern, because there is a pattern, it's just difficult to manage because you don't necessarily see the telegraph in the way you might expect, because the telegraph for the attack and the phase shift is coming from the phase you're in, and then that shifts and you might not necessarily be prepared for it, so it's very awkward to get a handle on. And because of that, I never enjoyed fighting that boss. I think it's cool mechanically, and I can see why they went with that, and I'm sure there are people that are much better at dealing with that than I am, but it definitely gets a spot on one of my least favorite boss fights, just period. That said though, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. So there's been a few times I wanted to rage quit across the many games I have played, though do let me know what you think about all these and your own times you might have wanted to rage quit, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.